Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says this, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." We're in this series on relationships right now, and we were all made for relationship. God created us to know Him and be known by Him, and to know others and be known by others. And we know Jesus' word, the greatest commandments are to love God and to love others as yourself. And when we're talking about relationships, the reason I come to this verse is because I remember in college, I took a class on the book of Romans, and my professor talked about the cycle of doing and thinking and how one reinforces the other. And so when we do things one way, we start to think that way. And then when we start to think that way, we start to do things along that line of thinking. And so this passage, we kind of have a choice of which cycle do we want to be in? Do we want to be in the cycle of the world where we think the way the world thinks and do the things the world does? Or do we want to be transformed and think the way that God thinks and do the things that God does? And as we talk about relationships, we have to assume that God, being good, created us to have good relationships. I love that part where it says that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. And I think God wants us to have good, acceptable, and perfect relationships, but really the only way that we can do that is if we're willing to kind of reverse the cycle. In one way or another, we've all been formed by the patterns of the world. And unfortunately, more often than not, the world is wrong. And we develop these patterns of doing and thinking that lead to less than good, less than acceptable, and less than perfect relationships. And so we've talked about this concept of demolition. If you've seen Extreme Makeover Home Edition back in the day, they had demo day where they'd bring in a bunch of people to just sledgehammers and all these different things they would do to just tear down a house before they could build a new one. And in the same way, we have to kind of tear down our old ways of thinking and doing and think and do new things, do them God's way. One of the things that I also learned in college was to start utilizing the Message translation of the Bible. I'd heard of the Message translation before, and there's a lot of debate on how legitimate the Message translation is, because most translations are done by a committee of scholars that translate the Bible together to try to make sure it's as accurate as possible. And the Message was just this one guy who wanted to not necessarily give an exact translation, but to paraphrase the scripture's ideas into something that was relatable for everyday people. And I love Eugene Peterson's Message translation of this passage in Romans chapter 12. He says, "Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, and you'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you and develops well-formed maturity in you." And I know that if we want to have good, acceptable, and perfect relationships, the way to do that is to kind of demolish our old way of thinking and submit to God's new way of thinking and new way of doing. So my encouragement for all of us is to not conform to the patterns of this world, but be dedicated to renewing our minds.